What's up, everyone? Tera Roberts here with Fantasy Pros with 10 matchups to avoid for Week 14. Before I get into the list, want a chance to win a signed DK Metcalf Seattle Seahawks jersey courtesy of Pristine Auction, the premier autographed sports memorabilia auction house? You need to subscribe to the Fantasy Pros YouTube channel right now. Comment below on this video, and that's it. We'll be announcing the winner right here on the channel, so make sure you turn on those notifications so you can know when new videos are up and to claim your prize. Didn't win? You can still sign up at pristineauction.com using the link in our video description, and if you use registration code FANTASYPROS, you'll get $10 off your first order. Now let's go ahead and dive right in. First up, Matt Stafford. This is a bit risky because Matt Stafford is coming off 2 excellent games in a row with a total of 7 touchdowns and just 1 interception, and it's probably not a coincidence that those games align with the return of Kyren Williams. The Rams' offense just flows better with Williams back. They simply look like a different team. But matchups against Baltimore are just flat out bad. And again, while Stafford did look fantastic last week against Cleveland, there's a reasonable explanation. The Browns were missing Denzel Ward, a very critical piece to their pass defense. And while Myles Garrett played last week, he'd been dealing with an injury and he didn't really seem like his usual self statistically. The Browns have also given up multiple strong performances to quarterbacks this year. The Ravens' only significant performance given up to a quarterback was Josh Dobbs in Week 8, a 200 passing yard performance with 2 passing touchdowns but 2 interceptions and boosted by a rushing touchdown. I don't think this week will be a complete dud, but there are better streaming options available. Next up, Cooper Kupp. Matt Stafford isn't the only Ram with a bad matchup here. Technically, it's a bad matchup for all of them, but Kyren Williams is still an RB1, even in a bad matchup based off volume, and Puka Nacua is still a good start based off volume, but lack of volume here is the big issue with Cooper Kupp, and you combine that lack of volume with a terrible matchup, and Kupp is just a risky play this week. We talked about the Ravens defense, and a key piece of that defense returning is likely this week. It is Marlon Humphrey. Occasionally we see teams where they shut down quarterbacks in terms of fantasy points, but they still allow decent performances to wide receivers. That is not the case with Baltimore. They have allowed the fewest points to opposing quarterbacks and the second fewest to opposing wide receivers. Kupp's Week 13 performance was his first double-digit fantasy point performance since Week 6. So what changed? Volume increased a tiny bit, but the difference here was literally a touchdown. Without a touchdown, he's right below 10 fantasy points again. Touchdown dependency for a game against the Ravens is a bad combination. We'll talk about one more bad matchup from this Rams-Ravens game, but we'll go to the other side and we will talk about one Raven to avoid, Gus Edwards. Gus Edwards is the literal definition of a touchdown-dependent running back, and to be fair, the touchdowns have been flowing, but we got a taste of what a game looks like without a touchdown for Gus Edwards, and in their last matchup, it was ugly. 8 carries for 26 yards and 1 reception for 11 yards for a grand total of 4.7 fantasy points. The Rams are a terrible matchup for opposing running backs. They have allowed the 7th least fantasy points to running backs, ironically 1 spot above the Ravens, and the last time they allowed a rushing touchdown to a running back was back in Week 9. On top of that, Edwards has to contend with Keaton Mitchell. Keaton Mitchell outsnapped Gus Edwards in their last game and outperformed Edwards as well. So less snaps, bad matchup, low opportunity for touchdowns, avoid Gus Edwards. Next up, Nico Collins. There's a degree to which you can avoid this matchup. Nico Collins was the overall wide receiver 3 last week with nearly 200 receiving yards against Denver. With a guy like that, you will never sit him for a guy like Jerry Jeudy. But because of where you drafted Nico Collins, you probably have strong options that you could start over him. And you should pivot to those options this week, and the reason is very simple. With Tank Dell out for the season, we know for sure that Sauce Gardner will be covering Nico Collins this week. Sauce is capable of shutting down any wide receiver 1. Talent does often find a way to produce. Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle had excellent games against the Jets. Devontae Adams and Keenan Allen had decent games of between 14 to 15 fantasy points, but not big upside. I would expect a decrease in production from Nico Collins with more so wide receiver 2 upside this week. Pivot to your higher tier options. Next up, Justin Herbert. We talked about that strong performance that Nico Collins had last week despite the difficult matchup against Denver. Well, it is critical to note that strong receiving performances don't necessarily correlate with the quarterback. The Broncos are a horrible matchup for opposing quarterbacks, and Justin Herbert's upside is severely limited here. Nico Collins had near 200 receiving yards, and CJ Stroud had just 16 fantasy points. The Broncos have been one of the most difficult matchups for quarterbacks since Week 5, and Herbert has struggled in back-to-back weeks facing difficult matchups. Making the argument for benching a guy like Herbert is tough, but if there was ever a week to warrant it, this is the one. Brock Purdy is coming off a strong 4-touchdown, 300-plus yard performance in Week 13, but that was definitely a very advantageous matchup. This week's matchup with Seattle isn't a terrible matchup, but we've seen this matchup before literally just 2 weeks ago. San Francisco dominated Seattle, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it. They dominated through Christian McCaffrey, who had 19 carries for 114 yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. Purdy had just 209 passing yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception. Given the fact that this matchup was so recent, it's reasonable to expect a similar game plan here. And for that reason, pivoting from Purdy is very acceptable. Next up, Derrick Henry. Everyone knows that as the season goes on and the weather gets colder, Derrick Henry turns into a Yeti and absolutely dominates. And here we are again. Derrick Henry on his winter hot streak, coming off 2 games with 2 touchdowns in each game. But Henry is heading down south to Miami, and this is just a bad setup for Henry. Miami hasn't allowed a rushing touchdown since Week 7 and have allowed running backs to get over 100 yards on the ground just 1 time this season, Week 2 against Austin Eckler. It's easy to understand why. The Dolphins' offense jumps out aggressively, and teams playing behind simply can't afford to establish the run. Tennessee doesn't have the defense to stop Miami or the offense to keep up. This is a recipe for disaster, and Derrick Henry could suffer. Tony Pollard has finally found his way on the ground and has had a touchdown in each of the past 3 games. He's also seen increased usage through the air, but we would be remiss to not look at the fact that those 3 games have been in very run-friendly matchups. Carolina, Washington, and Seattle. It is not really a surprise that he bounced back given the bad matchups, but this week's matchup against Philadelphia is a hard fade. For every bit of vulnerable Philadelphia's pass defenses, their run defense is excellent. And we've already seen Tony Pollard in this matchup a month ago. The result was 12 carries for 51 yards and 3 receptions for 12 yards, 9.3 fantasy points. Prepare to be underwhelmed and avoid this matchup if you can. Another running back in a bad matchup is DeAndre Swift. Don't let last week's defensive meltdown by Dallas lull you into thinking this is a good matchup. This is an absolute no-go. Last week's performance by Zach Charbonnet against Dallas was literally the 2nd best fantasy performance by a running back against Dallas this season. Charbonnet had 16.9 fantasy points. The only other running back to have success against Dallas was James Conner back in Week 3, another very strange game. And if you aren't 100% convinced, this is another matchup that we've already seen. Swift played Dallas back in Week 9, and the result was 18 carries for 43 yards and 2 receptions for 31 yards, just 9.4 fantasy points in PPR. And the final matchup to avoid is any quarterback for New Orleans against Carolina. At the time of filming this video, I don't know if Jameis Winston or Derek Carr will start for New Orleans, but what I do know is that Carolina is a horrific matchup for opposing quarterbacks. We had Baker Mayfield on the list last week, and avoiding him was 100% the correct move. Week after week, Carolina has shut down quarterbacks from Dak Prescott to CJ Stroud. It's not changing, and it's only going to get worse as they get healthier in their secondary. Heading into the week, I thought the second concussion to Derek Carr would be a multi-week absence, so looking at adding Jameis Winston made sense. But 1 week stint doesn't really justify it here if it's only against Carolina, and starting Carr here is a bad idea too. It's only the quarterback we're avoiding here. The wide receiver 1 can still have a strong outing. Avoid the New Orleans quarterback this week. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like the video and subscribe to Fantasy Pros. And remember, if you want a chance to win a signed DK Metcalf Seattle Seahawks jersey courtesy of Pristine Auction, the premier autographed sports memorabilia auction house, you need to subscribe to the Fantasy Pros YouTube channel right now. Comment below on this video, and that's it. We'll be announcing the winner right here on the channel, so make sure you turn on those notifications so you can know when new videos are up and to claim your prize. Didn't win? You can still sign up at pristineauction.com using the link in our video description, and if you use the registration code FantasyPros, you'll get $10 off your first order.